Wise, and today we'll be going down the rabbit hole of Descartes Metaphysics. Since this is the first episode of The Rabbit Hole, let me say a few things about the program. When you're working on a project in philosophy, you naturally come across all sorts of fascinating views of the world that are worth exploring. Problem is, most of them are side paths and keep you from the main road of your project. So you need to move on and focus. Not going down the rabbit hole is usually the goal. While focus is surely of virtue, I think some of the hidden gems one tends to come across are far too interesting to rot in a waste book, and they're 100% worth sharing with you. This podcast gives me the opportunity to do that. So what's in the rabbit hole of Descartes' metaphysics? When hearing the name of Descartes and metaphysics, we usually associate the famous cogito or perhaps certain views about how our bodies relate to our minds. At least that's what I used to think of when Descartes was mentioned. What I was at best dimly aware of is how Descartes thinks about how the world of ordinary objects such as mountains, houses, or trees comes to be. And this is the topic that I'm going to explore with you today. In doing so, we'll be dealing with a fascinating thought experiment about the creation of the world. We'll find out why Descartes thinks that what we smell, hear, and see doesn't really exist, and why and in what ways Descartes' ideas were truly revolutionary at his time. Okay, let's get down the rabbit hole and start with why Descartes was innovative. When Descartes developed his ideas, a widespread view was that things have something like an inner essence or nature that structures their various qualities. So, for instance, a house is so and so large, has such shape, color, and so on. These are its qualities or features. And the then contemporary standard view was that these features are real entities, so not something that comes to be only in our minds. Descartes was no fan of this idea. But what he was even more worried about is the other element of the standard view, namely the idea that things have inner natures or essences. The proponents of the standard view, so those who were in favor of it, thought that a house is not just a bunch of qualities, but that there is furthermore a sort of core that connects all those features. That could be, for instance, that a house serves a purpose, namely of providing shelter, and that its specific tendencies as a thing in this world could only be understood if we accept that there is such a thing as the essence of a house. Descartes, however, found it hard to wrap his head around this idea. Especially he thought that we can understand how things come to be without making so many assumptions in the first place, and this led him to some ideas that were quite unusual at the time. So, for instance, he thought that neither essences or qualities are really real. What is real, according to Descartes, are bits of matter, with the sole property of being extended in space. And what we perceive as red or sweet or bright really all comes down to different movements of tiny particles. So when you think there is a red door, Descartes would say all there really is are particles moving such that you get this impression. Now, this is not so much of a skeptical point, but rather an attempt to base our conception of the world on a solid fundament that we can clearly grasp. And Descartes thought it to be evident that material things occupy space. That is, they have breadth and depth and height. That's basic, but everything else, the fact that some matter is red or has a certain shape, is only a variation of the underlying basic idea of extension. Everything is particle movement in some sense, so that means all the qualities that we perceive depend on matter or bits of matter moving in a certain way. That's his view. For every question, why, basically, then the answer is to point out to an underlying constellation of bits of matter and their motion. Now, admittedly, that is quite counterintuitive to how we normally approach the world we inhabit. But at the same time, Descartes' view is not so far away from how natural scientists up to the present day tend to think of the phenomena we find in the world. Do away with uncritical assumptions and find the underlying physical mechanisms on which things depend. At Descartes' time, however, it was risky to speak openly about such ideas, because they were perceived to be at odds with theological teachings. In order to explain his view in a way that was not overly confrontative to religious authorities, Descartes used what is called a thought experiment. That is, a scenario that tests the effectiveness of a certain theory in an as-if mode. So the spirit is not to boldly claim how things are, but rather to imagine things were such and such, and then to ask, would that yield a convincing view of the world? Descartes carefully invites us to an imaginary journey away from the actual world. So let's have a look at how Descartes formulates this idea. Here is what he says. For a while then, allow your thought to wander beyond this world, to view another world, a wholly new one which I, Descartes, shall bring into being before your mind in imaginary spaces. And Descartes continues to add some flesh to the bones of this scenario and says, let us suppose that God creates anew so much matter all around us that in whatever direction our imagination may extend, it no longer perceives any place which is empty. The point of this first step of this thought experiment is to make absolutely sure that the matter God creates has no intrinsic forms or even any qualities other than those of three-dimensional extension, that is, length, breadth, and depth. Remember that these three basic qualities of extension are the only qualities that Descartes allows as basic and intrinsic to matter. But of course, he knew that the imaginary world he invites us to create would be a rather dull place if everything was only ever characterized in these basic terms. Where are the rivers and mountains, the colors and shapes, and the trees and the houses that we know to inhabit the real world? All this and more, Descartes suggests, could be created in the following way. In addition to creating matter, God divides it into parts and sets these parts in motion. We can imagine a world of various chunks of matter in all sizes and shapes, moving in different directions. The only addition is that God makes sure all these bits of matter move in accordance with the ordinary laws of nature, as Descartes writes. If this is granted, he argues, we can do entirely without any pre-given form or order in the world. And I quote again, for God has established these laws in such a marvelous way that even if we suppose he sets up no order or proportion within it, but composes from it a chaos as confused and muddled as any of the poets could describe, the laws of nature are sufficient to cause the parts of this chaos to disentangle themselves and arrange themselves in such good order that they will have the form of a quite perfect world. A world in which we shall be able to see not only light, but also all other things, general as well as particular, which appear in the real world. The idea Descartes puts forth in this imaginative creation of the world is that everything we know can be explained as the result of material particles interacting according to some basic rules, the laws of nature. If you perceive something to be hot, well, that's because the particles it consists of move very fast. And if we think it's red, well, then this is also because the matter it is made from moves in a way that causes our eyes and brains to produce the corresponding perception. The same would apply to all other qualities of things. They are, for Descartes, the result of the manifold ways in which matter can be split up into pieces and move and interact. What is more, if we want to know how a complex thing, such as a mountain or a tree, comes to be, this can be understood as the result of the transformation bits of matter undergo through their various interactions. A mountain is nothing other than bits of matter hitting on each other until they have the shape and chemical structure of a mountain. And from Descartes' point of view, the same applies to organisms as well. There is nothing in a plant that is not the result of material particles interacting according to natural laws. Especially, Descartes insisted, there is no necessity to assume anything like a pre-existing construction plan or form for how a plant should be built. Such appeal to an inner nature or essence is, in his judgment, simply superfluous for explaining the generation of even very complex things. After all, they are nothing other than an upshot of God's original creation of matter, its motion, and his wisdom to create the laws of nature to govern this process. Now, as always with rabbit holes, they get deeper and deeper, and one needs to find a way out without having explored all the corridors. If you like to explore further, the passages I quoted are from Descartes' book The World, which you can find, for instance, in Volume 1 of Descartes' Philosophical Writings, translated by John Cottingham and others. I, for my part, have to climb back to the surface now and leave the rabbit hole. But I won't do so without giving you a reason to be a little bit skeptical about the view Descartes invites. As other philosophers, such as Kant, should later point out, in some cases it seems to be simply insufficient to just explain how something comes about through causal interactions of matter. Especially in the case of living organisms such as trees, there seems to be a more sophisticated process that does not only follow natural laws, but rules that are more specific to the sort of thing that comes to be. When a tree grows from a seed, for instance, it's not just matter arranging itself tree-wise spontaneously. Rather, the idea of being arranged tree-wise seems to guide this process from early on. The phenomenon of growth actually demands the result, a tree, and that way somehow feeds back into the causal chain of events that its realization depends on. Much like the construction plan of a house provides guidance for those who build the house by putting one stone on another. This and related worries led Kant to think that when we are evaluating natural things like plants or animals, we should do so as if they were built according to an immanent conception of the whole organism. So precisely in a way that Descartes wanted to avoid at all costs. If you're now wondering why Kant wants to evaluate things only as if they were built that way, you're already on your way to a new rabbit hole that might come up in another episode.